I'd like to introduce our bishop. Bishop Medley was born on September 17th, 1952 in Marion County to the late Dorothy Hayden Medley and the late James Werner Medley. He was baptized at St. Francis Church in St. Francis, Kentucky. After attending St. Thomas Seminary High School, Bishop Medley received a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and Psychology from Bellarmine, a Master of Divinity from St. Meinrad in Theology, and before his ordination in 1982, Bishop Medley served as a social worker for the Kentucky Department of Human Resources from 1974 to 1978. Then he was ordained to priesthood on May 22, 1982, at the Cathedral of the Assumption by Archbishop Thomas Kelly. After ordination, he became associate pastor at St. Pius X Parish in Louisville. He also served as the chaplain to Assumption High School. That would have been from 82 to 85. In June 85, he was assigned as associate pastor at the Cathedral of the Assumption. And then in 88, he was assigned as pastor to St. Benedict, Charles Borromeo, and Holy Cross Parish. In 1990, they merged and became St. Martin de Porres Parish. In 1989, he was also appointed as the director of the Office of Clergy Personnel. In September of 93 until June of 2005, Bishop Medley was pastor of St. Joseph Proto-Cathedral in Bardstown, which is the original see of the Archdiocese of Louisville. In June of 2005, he was appointed pastor of Mother of Good Counsel Church, and in 2007, pastor of Transfiguration of Our Lord in Goshen, Kentucky. And those two parishes merged and became St. Bernadette Parish. So you can see he knows about merging. Bishop Medley was ordained the fourth bishop of the Diocese of Owensboro in February 10th, 2010, following the announcement December 15th of 2009 by Archbishop Samby. So we're glad to have you with us this morning. Bishop Medley is going to be speaking on the Gospels of Mercy. Bishop Medley.
Well, when the opening verses of the Bible says, in the beginning, the earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss. And we speak then, that's not me ringing, is it? Okay. I should have known I'd catch her. Yeah. So we used to talk about philosophers trying to imagine what the universe was before the act of creation. But now I guess we talk about physicists trying to figure out what the world was, what the universe was before the act of creation. But I think the word that comes to my mind, and one that we used in theology, and I suspect, though I'm far from a natural scientist or a physical scientist, I suspect that maybe even physicists could describe the world or the universe before the Big Bang or an act of creation as chaos. So then we're told that God, a mighty wind, by the hand of God, a mighty wind swept over the waters, and then the dry land was separated from the sea, and then that beautiful hymn of creation on the first day. God set the sun and the moon and the stars and the skies, and then at the end of that day he saw that it was all very good. And then that hymn goes on to portray the good things that came about through creation. and that chaos was tamed. And those 6 days of creation culminate in, on the sixth day, God created them, male and human beings. Male and female, He created them. In the divine image, He created them. And He entrusted to them this creation. Now, that's one of two stories of creation. The second, that's in the first chapter of Genesis. In the second chapter of Genesis, we have, we might say, a more intentional God walking already amidst the garden. So the two stories can fit together. But for those of you who have studied scriptures, we know that they come from two different sources. And somewhere along the way, they all began to get merged in the mindset of the ancient Hebrews. And the scriptures began to evolve that became our own, that were the precursor to the Gospels. So we have this moment of chaos having been tamed, this placid, beautiful earth. In the second chapter of Genesis, it's called the Garden of Eden. We call it paradise. And into this paradise, chaos returns when man and woman sins. But to set some text here. On March 13th, 2013, every media outlet in the world trained our attention on the Vatican and a little lonely chimney sitting over the Sistine Chapel, and they speculated it looks like the smoke is white. And of course, for time immemorial, and according to our church tradition, we know that means we have a new Bishop of Rome, we have a new Pope. And so it was only moments later that the bells began to ring, and anybody that could get in front of a TV, Protestant or Catholic alike, were glued to the TV to see who's going to step out on that balcony of St. Peter's, who's going to be introduced. It's a momentous occasion. And I think it says a lot about, even in the 21st century, even in an age that is marked by secularism, Catholics still fascinate the world. And I think with good reason. So, this man, Jorge Bergoglio, was introduced. Immediately he began to speculate because he didn't come out crowned in jewels and furry hats and all sorts of things. He came out in a simple white cassock and he was introduced. And I don't speak Latin. I studied a little bit of Latin, but I wouldn't pretend. But you know, habemus papam. We have a pope. We all know what they're going to say. And then there's this line. And there was a group of us there at the Catholic Pastoral Center listening. And when we got to the end, nobody had recognized this cardinal's name, who is now Pope. And I said, well, I don't know who he is. I don't know where he came from, but he took the name Francis because I knew whatever the last word in that sentence was going to tell us who it was. And he said Franciscum. So I said, and I looked around and said, I don't think there's ever been a Francis before, has there? So immediately, the vision of a man in a simple white cassock as opposed to jewels, with a name that had never been chosen before, began to give us an indication. From that balcony, Francis, somewhere in that, I'd have to go back and reread the exact text, but he spoke of God's mercy. Now, those who knew Jorge Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, well, probably heard that and said, ka-ching, we're going to hear a lot about that. But for most of us who did not know who Cardinal Bergoglio, now Francis, was, we could not have foreseen that Francis looks at the Gospels of Jesus Christ, looks at all of creation through the eyes of mercy. And he has convinced us, he certainly convinced me, that that is a very apt prism through which to view Almighty God. Fast forward just a little bit, it didn't take him long to make it clear that he was going to talk about mercy, and he was going to talk about mercy a lot. So much so that he decreed that there would be a Jubilee year of mercy that we now are part of. It began last year on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and this Jubilee year will conclude this year with the Feast of Christ the King. My reflection today is to set this Jubilee within the entirety of sacred Scripture. For those who would see Francis as some sort of nut, and there are people that see Francis as some sort of nut. We're a big church, and so we have a lot of ideas. We simply look, or for this Jubilee year of mercy, I think we look to whom he looks, a kind and merciful God with a good track record. And a good track record that is marked over and over and over again by mercy. Now, Scripture has and reveals and portrays its rules and laws, certainly most notably beginning early on with the Ten Commandments given to Moses. In Amoris Laetitia, the apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis, just published last Friday, his summation and his teaching following the Synod of 2014 and the Synod of 2015, both about the family, he regrounds us in the Judeo-Christian tradition that law is made for human beings. People are not made for the law. Now, where did he get that? Jesus. Jesus said that. When scribes and Pharisees were constantly reminding Jesus, now this is the law, you know what you're supposed to do, and he got kind of frustrated. He said, got this all backwards. Human beings weren't created just so we could fit into this legalistic lawful system. This legalistic lawful system was created to help human beings be more what they were created to be, image and likeness of God. And the story, I think, I'm not certain about this, but I think the story that triggered his annoyance there, where he and his disciples were walking. Just walking. It was a Sabbath. Just taking a simple walk. They were walking through a grain field. And as they walk through a grain field, the image one has is that the grain's probably about waist high. The disciples were perhaps raking their hands through the ripened grain, and heads of the grain fell into their hands, and they would eat them. And the Pharisees just couldn't handle it. The law says you do not work on the Sabbath. They're picking grain. It's against the law. Tell them to stop. And Jesus said, "Oh, Lord, give me a break." And then he said, this is just, what you know he wanted to say. I always like to preach the gospel of what I think Jesus wanted to say. Gets me in trouble sometimes. What he wanted to say is, come on, grow up. This is not labor. These are people enjoying it. But, the law into the world into which Jesus was born, there were laws about how many steps you could take on the Sabbath. So obsessed with being able to define every moment and every dot and tittle of our being and existence, they had written down a law about it. If that sounds familiar, sounds a lot like the Catholic Church at various ages of our existence, and maybe to some extent the Catholic Church that you and I have grown up and loved and still flourishes in 2016. Back to Genesis. Genesis 1 and 2. Chapter 1 and 2. The sun, the moon, the star, the dry land, the plants, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, creepy, crawly things. Man and woman in the divine image, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God looked at everything he had made and he found it very good. And again, the image that I've often been taught and even found myself preaching on is that God tamed the chaos. The second story of creation, this is where we actually have the name Adam. And God saw that Adam needed a suitable partner. And so while he slept, God came and took a rib from Adam's side. And from that rib, he formed the woman Eve, and he presented her to Adam. And he said, "This at last is your partner. This is your equal." And the way that story of creation concludes, interestingly, giving some of our subsequent history of chaos and sin, he said, the man and woman were both naked, yet they felt no shame. Then the next chapter, chapter 3 of Genesis begins. Now the snake was the most cunning of all animals. If you're making a movie, you almost hear the hard music, dum, 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 the snake slithering along right now. We know the story. The snake tempted the man and the woman. They ate of the fruit of the one tree that Jesus had said, "This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Just leave it alone. Look at what you've got. A universe. Just leave this one tree alone. So God made one rule. But when we have one rule in front of us, we have to break it. It's just the way we are. But that's God's fault. Goes back to that image of God. God created them. Male and female, God created them. In the divine image, God created them. And what we mean when we say that we, Adam and Eve, and we, the first man and woman, we were created in the divine image, is that we were created with freedom. And doggone it, if you have freedom, you're going to use it. And you're going to use it sometimes for good, and we're going to use it sometimes for bad. So, they just had to, we can go into all the symbolism about snakes and that some of the counter cultures around those Hebrew people of ancient, they worship snakes, so it was just you couldn't hardly pass on, if you're going to write on how humanity got in such a mess, you got to look over and say, well, it must be their fault. They think snakes are cool, so we're going to make the snake the evil one here. So they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Freedom to reject that which God set before them. The chaos that God had pushed back, that God had set aside, the chaos returned. And then the book of Genesis continues to portray that chaos. We have the Cain and Abel tragedy. Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain was a shepherd, grew flocks, raised flocks. Cain grew grain. They both offered their sacrifice. But we're told, and sometimes I reread some of this, and you think, well, these stories are so compact. Abel's offering was pleasing to God, and Cain's was not. Doesn't exactly say why. Now, I remember what I was taught in catechism, that Cain didn't offer the best. Cain didn't offer the best, and Abel did. That's why but it really doesn't say that. But I suppose better scripture scholars than me read between the lines and know what that's all about. So Cain kills Abel. Again, chaos reigns again. We move on, the stories continue until we get to Genesis, and God is just up to here with the whole thing. Well, I had it pretty good. Chaos or no chaos, nobody was bothering me till I bothered to create this man and woman in my own image and give them freedom. And so when the Lord God saw how great the wickedness of human beings was on earth, the Lord regretted making human beings. And he said, I will wipe out from the earth all living creatures, for I regret that I made them. In other words, I know how to clean up this chaos. But this character named Noah, it says, found favor with God. Again, we don't go back and reread these things often enough. Or I should say, I don't. But when I saw that Noah found favor with God, I thought of the story in Luke's gospel when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary. Behold, Hail Mary, you have found favor with God. So time and time and time again, in order to try to restore the harmony of God's creation, God has chosen a man or a woman in whom he finds favor. And so, Noah was given his instructions, build an ark, then take 2 of every animal, go on there, and then with your family, and I will preserve that which I created. The floods came, 40 days and 40 nights, all the earth was covered. Every living thing was destroyed. Noah sent out the dove that came back, and he knew that therefore there was no dry land upon which the dove could light. So they stayed holed up in the ark. And he sent the dove out again a few weeks later, and the dove came back with an olive branch. And so Noah knew that the earth was being restored, and they stayed a few more days, and then they finally opened up the hatches, and everybody came out, and it was like a new covenant. It was like the beginning of the Garden of Eden. Today the kids would say we hit the reset button. God hit the reset button and let us all get a fresh start. And then God set the rainbow in the sky as a sign of his covenant. And we might say as a sign of his mercy. So I'm talking a little bit about the Old Testament to get to the New Testament so that we can note that when Jesus came preaching and teaching, he did so in such a way as to identify the story of God that he had been taught, that had come down through the prophets and through the stories of creation. We have then, still in the book of Genesis, the story of Abram and Sarah, the deception of Rebekah and of Esau, the sons Esau and Jacob. Rebekah was an instrument of deceiving Jacob so that her more favored son, Rebekah and Isaac, so that her more favored son Jacob could have the first birthright, although it rightfully belonged to Esau. Genesis then is a story of corruption and chaos beginning with chaos. God gave us harmony. God created an idyllic world. And then by sin, and by the sin of one man and one woman, this all came crashing down and chaos returned. And so is set a stage for this epic, historic, biblical battle of biblical proportions, of the battle between chaos and harmony, between chaos and mercy. The final Old Testament story I want to refer to is the story of David. God had promised the people that he would send them a great king. And so we know all the story about, the sons were called forth one at a time, and Samuel said, this isn't the one, this isn't the one, this one doesn't please the Lord. And they said, well, there's not but one more, and he's a boy, he's out in the field, and he's a shepherd. That can't be. And they said, well, bring him in here. And he said, oh, this is it. And they described him. He was ruddy, a youth with beautiful eyes and good looking. And so David found favor with God. And from that description, we'd say he probably found favor with a lot of people. Ruddy, youth with beautiful eyes and good looking. But fast forward, God gives David so much. But David had several wives. That didn't seem to be an issue, but nonetheless, cultural stories. In 2 Samuel, we find that David went out on his roof one night while the battles were raging, wars against the enemy, and he looked off and he saw the beautiful Bathsheba. Now, David was a married man, and so was Bathsheba. She was the wife of Uriah. He lusted for her, and he went to her, and they slept together, and she sent him word that she had conceived a child. Well, now, David was in a jam now. It was one thing to commit adultery. You can kind of sweep that under the rug and nobody knows. But a doggone baby just messes everything up in these kind of circumstances. So here was Bathsheba with a baby. Again, you'd probably have swept that under the rug, except that Uriah had been in battle for months. Uriah was going to know something was up when he got home. So the cunning David, the beautiful youth, the ruddy one with the beautiful eyes and good looking, he called and he said, Uriah is out in battle, right? Well, could you arrange it to where he kind of gets sent to the front? And then could you arrange it that maybe the battle will rage at that point? Yeah, King David, we can do that. And so Uriah died in battle, and David's secret was safe from all but Almighty God. And Nathan, the prophet, said, but in the sight of the Lord, what David had done was evil. And Nathan, those pesky prophets, he came and he said, okay, David, nobody else may be on to you, but God is. You got to make this right. So we're told David repented. The consequences were that the child born, but however, we're told, the story is clear, there were consequences. The child born to Bathsheba must die. That seems cruel, but the part of the taming of the chaos of sin often required that human beings pay a price. Adam and Eve, the price they had to pay was they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. The price that David and Bathsheba paid for their sin was that child would die. But God in His mercy, Bathsheba conceived yet again. And the second child born of David and Bathsheba was Solomon, who would succeed David as king. So again, we have a battle between chaos and harmony, between chaos and sin, between chaos and sin and mercy. And though David had sinned terribly, and no one was the wiser, but for God, God demanded repentance. That repentance came, and the kingdom of Israel under King David and ultimately his son Solomon continued to thrive. Fast forward to the Old Testament. Jesus is born into a culture of scribes and Pharisees obsessed with law as the proper avenue to holiness and righteousness. They were, almost every story we read, when you see scribes and Pharisees, you just kind of, you know that what we're talking about here is those who are smug, those who know the law and aren't going to hesitate for one moment to hold it over your head, to beat you to death with it, and all the time feel morally superior. And let us know that. Scribes and Pharisees did not die in first century Judea. They're still around. We know some of them. Think presidential debates in 2016. The smugness of moral superiority. It's not pretty and it doesn't help anybody. Talk about chaos and sin and a need for mercy. So I want to now just turn and talk a little bit about the gospel stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of how Jesus teaching on sin and mercy. How Jesus dealt with that chaos that had begun, that God had resolved, and that we in our freedom, because we have the freedom of being created in the image and likeness of God, we in our freedom bring back. Matthew 7, 1-5, Jesus says, stop judging that you may not be judged. But, who is he talking to? He's talking to scribes and Pharisees. The golden rule, 7:12 of Matthew. Do to others whatever you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets. Now, this was not the law and the prophets that scribes and Pharisees were teaching. The law to the culture to which Jesus was born was an oppressive law. And it was a law that was, as often as not, used to oppress people rather than lift people up. And needless to say, those in positions of power and authority, well, let's just say the law was usually applied to others, not to them. So I want to talk about particular stories that Jesus used as teaching. And by the way, if I were an English teacher, I don't think you could, I wanted to teach the genre of the short story. Jesus was one of the best short storytellers, and maybe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John then you could be. Imagine, I didn't count the words, but the story of the prodigal son. It's complete from beginning to end. You can read it in 3 or 4 minutes. It's a complete, now some short stories, run 20, 40, 50, 60, I suppose the genre. You could even get up to 80 or 100 pages and still consider that a short story before it's classified as a novel. It's one of my favorite forms of writing is to read short stories. And maybe it's because Jesus was perhaps the master storyteller, short storyteller of all time. Story of the prodigal son. Everything about it would have put the people who first heard this story, almost every aspect of this story would have just put their teeth on edge. Jesus was pushing his luck by telling this story. Just about every part of it was offensive to people who believed in right and law and fairness. It's a scandalous story. This young son has been dishonorable. He's made a fool of his father. He's asked, we picture him as young, some spoiled teenager, late teenager perhaps, looking around and saying, someday half of all this is going to be mine. But my goodness, my dad's not that old. I'm going to have to wait forever. This is ridiculous. So he goes and smugly says, how about giving me mine now? Well, the father should have just knocked him right in the head and said, get back to work. You're out of line. You're not entitled to this till I say you're entitled to this. But the father acquiesced. That would have just irritated Jesus' ears to no end. It irritates me. We all know spoiled children. You probably have seen some in your family. God forbid, but there might be a spoiled sister somewhere around the world that irritates the devil out of you. And they get away with murder. They just get away with everything. And here we have this smug little boy asking for his share, and we think, okay, the next part of the story is the father's just going to knock him a good one and then put him out digging ditches or something. But this foolish old man, probably wasn't even old, this foolish man gives him half of everything he had. And immediately, he cuts out and runs. Well, we can, again, short stories, one of the beauties of short stories is you can speculate a lot of other lines of the story that are not actually written. Can you imagine what this man's neighbors must have thought? What a fool. Why did he do that? Doesn't he see the logical consequence of this? They laughed at him. The indulgence in giving him his inheritance, surely aware. Who could not read those first lines of the story and say, this is not going to turn out well? We just know that. Graphically then, the story goes on about to describe a son living an utterly sinful and profane life, consorting with prostitutes, it said. So we can just picture him. He was, no doubt, among his peers, the life of the party, for as long as the money and the good times rolled. You know, people probably followed him like a magnet, because who was the first one to buy a round of beer? Him. Who was the first one to fulfill any of your dreams and fantasies? This young man was. But when you wantonly and profanely are throwing away everything you've got, the money runs out, and we know what happens to all of our good, dear friends when we're not giving them favor anymore. But he was reduced to what, again, telling this story in a Hebrew culture was the lowest of the low, the bottom of the barrel. Talk about hitting the bottom. He was reduced to tending swine. The Hebrews not only didn't eat swine, they didn't get around it, you know. When Jesus told the story about the miracle where the swine were cast off the bluff and the Hebrews, yes, that's what's supposed to happen to swine, filthy pigs. Okay. So in this rock bottom experience, the son concocts a scheme to go back because his situation was not going to improve. He was penniless. He was reduced to working among the swine. We might call that slopping the hogs. That perhaps I can go back. He knew the servants on my father's estate lived a lot better than this. They live with greater dignity. And at the very least, they don't have anything to do with swine because my father's a Hebrew. So I can at least get out of this. There was no pride to swallow. Pride was gone. There was only desperation. That's what this young son was up about. The decision to return, and this is important, does not reflect contrition. It reflects self-pity. It's self-serving. I can do better if I go back and prostrate myself before my father. Not, I didn't do my father justice. It does not reflect love. It reflects self-love. If we can call it that. It's self-serving. Along the way, he is smart enough to rehearse a line. All along the way, you know, however many days or months it took him to find his way back to his father's house, I will fall on my knees and I will say, I've sinned against God and against you, Father. I do not deserve to be called your son. Now, the argument could be made that this was genuine contrition, but it never says he was sorry for what he did for the father. He was rehearsing a line. I've sinned against God and against you. I do not deserve to be called your son. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we glimpse a father who never stopped loving and never stopped longing. And for the most part, the neighbors probably never stopped laughing. Look at that old man. We could have told him, we probably did tell him, everybody in the world probably told him, this isn't going to turn out well, don't indulge this boy, but the father did it, and he's grieved ever since. And so then we find that, again, the power of the short story, all the things you can fill in, when it says, while he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. Now, how did the father happen to catch sight of him? Well, the way I see the story projected often is that this foolish old man who everybody had warned, don't do this, it's not going to turn out well, probably went to the highest point on his estate every day and stayed there most of the day, looking out over the horizon, longing that his son might come back. Now, was this a few weeks? Was this a few months? Was these a few years? The storyteller doesn't have to tell us. But we do have an image of a pathetic old man continuing to make... Was it bad enough that he made a fool of himself and let the son carry all that off? But he's the one that continues to grieve. Rather than get on with his life becomes obsessed with trying to find the son that's out there someplace. Made a fool of, and continues to make a fool of himself every day. Looking out, hoping, longing. And when the son returns, remember the son is walking along, dirty, probably smells like pigs, clothes tattered and torn, repeating this line, because it's got to be well rehearsed if it's going to be convincing. Father, I've sinned against God and against you. Father, I've sinned against God and against you. I don't deserve to be called your son. The father spots him. Doesn't look like his son anymore. His son who was well dressed, who wore jewels, who had rings on his fingers, who, if we wrote the story today, was driving a sports car. The son's limping along. And it says the father ran to him. And the son begins his rehearsed line. No need for that. Cuts him off. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Kill the fatted calf. Put a garment on him. The young son does not have to speak. He never speaks another word. He practiced and he practiced. Father didn't let him say. But as far as the short story goes, he never has to speak another word. What could he say? What could he say? And the party began. It even just says it that way. And the party began. But for the older brother, who won't come inside, and is just sitting there, standing out there pouting. And with some good cause. Again, if you're listening to this story, now we have listened to the story so much and we call it the sad older brother, but I feel some sympathy for him. Haven't you been in the older brother's shoes? Where somebody around you just screwed up everything, and then they get a break. A break that you can't see that you ever got. So, I'd pout too. So he's standing there. Somebody apparently goes in and tells the father, whispers to the father, your son's out there. He doesn't want to come in. And so the son goes out. He goes out. And he is angry. He said, how can you do this? And this is where we learn exactly what happened. He's been out, he's been consorting with prostitutes, he's thrown your money away, he's done everything imaginable to embarrass you, he's made a fool of you, and you would do this? You've never even given me a lamb to have a party with my friends. And the father says, everything I have is yours. You've been here at arm's length my whole life, your whole life. Come. Your brother who was lost has been found. But the story concludes with the pouting, angry son outside and the young, rebellious son being lavished with the best of everything. As I said, everything about that story is wrong by our human reckoning. Just shouldn't happen. Jesus is telling that story to exemplify what mercy is. The chaos of this young man's sin, the chaos of the father's foolishness is all wiped away by the mercy. All healed by the mercy. And we're left with that older brother standing out there in the cold, not coming into the party. And we're left with the thought that the only way to fail to receive the mercy of God is to reject it. Mercy will never be withheld from you or me, no matter what we've done, no matter how mean or ornery or sinful we've been. God's mercy is going to be abundant and God's mercy is going to be there. The only way we cannot experience that mercy, because God's trying to push it on us, is to close the door and wall ourselves off. And so this becomes a very, I think the older brother is one of the most potent characters of all the scriptures and certainly of all the gospel that exemplifies the abundance of God's love, and yet that love can be rejected. And so when we talk about heaven and hell, do I believe in hell? Yes. I believe that people are capable of rejecting God and rejecting everything about God. And that's what this brother exemplifies. Another gospel story. Peter. I love Peter. He just couldn't help but get his foot in his mouth. Every chance he had, he made a fool of himself. In the end, we know he loved Jesus. We can identify with that. You know, everybody here can say, and sincerely in our prayer, I love Jesus. But we know how many times we've made a fool of ourselves and we've fallen short. So Peter, nonetheless, Jesus is teaching as they go along, and Peter always, wanting to be the head of the class. Lord, Lord, Lord. Sister, 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 Lord, Lord, Lord. Peter always had his hand up first. He wanted to be the one to answer. And they're talking about sin and mercy and forgiveness. And so Peter thinks, okay, I know this one. I'm going to come off well. Lord, if my brother sins against me, how many times do I have to forgive him? 7 times? Because Peter knew that somewhere in all these ancient laws, it was written that you had to be merciful. You had to forgive. But law is law, and there have to be limits. There have to be some boundaries on the law, and somewhere it was written that 7 was it. So Peter was hoping Peter was setting himself up to say, very well done, servant. Very well done, son. You have been studying, you get an A today. Well, poor Peter. Jesus answered, not from the presumed law. He said, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, I don't know Hebrew, because sometimes in the Bible this is rendered as 7 times 7, sometimes it's 77, and sometimes it's 70 times 7. So I don't know which it is. The point is, Jesus is trying to say, don't count. That's not what this is about. Don't keep a little notebook in your pocket and write down and say, oops, I met the quota. You're out of luck now. I don't have to forgive you again. Just forget it. So poor Peter comes across having looked stingy and legalistic again. Jesus is saying, don't count. A very high bar for us as human beings. We like to count. We like to keep records. We like for the books to balance. And when they don't, something's not working. Another powerful short story in John's Gospel. Jesus had been praying and teaching in the temple. And so everybody around Jerusalem knew that he was there. And so a lot of them, he was stepping on a lot of toes. He kept saying, woe to you scribes and Pharisees. And he just, so there were people just stinging from his teaching. And so we're told that the leaders of the people said, okay, let's huddle here. We got to do something about this man. What are we going to do? Well, I got an idea. So one would guess, again, in the interest of a short story, a lot gets untold. We fill in the blanks. They know that this woman is messing around, and it wouldn't take much to catch her in the very act of adultery. So apparently they do. And so, it's a vivid account. Even slightly catechized or preached to can pick up the story and its details. The scribes and the Pharisees bring this woman to Jesus as he's teaching on the steps of the temple. You can almost picture them holding on to her, pushing her forward. And they didn't give a hoot about that woman. They didn't give a hoot what she had done. It was Jesus they were after. says she was caught in the very act of adultery. Now think of the literalness of that. Not only was she sinful, she was indiscreet. I mean, if you're going to commit adultery, for God's sakes, at least lock the door, right? So, the implication, it doesn't say this, the implication is maybe she did this for a living. But again, that's not said there. But again, that's the thing about short stories. You can fill in all sorts of blanks. You can also fill in the blanks about, well, how do the men know who she was? How do they know where she was? How do they know how to find her? Maybe they had been there a time or 2 or 12 or whatever. Who knows? But again, think of the literalness of the story. Caught in the very act of adultery. And she's humiliated. Thoroughly. Shamed. Not only was she sinful, but she was indiscreet. Now, again, it's one of the great mysteries of biblical history is, what about the guy? He's not mentioned. That probably tells us some things about the law and the Hebrew law themselves. It probably tells us something about the relationship of men and women throughout history. The law says she's to be stoned, the men say, righteously, smugly, with moral superiority. They knew the law. They could have quoted a chapter and verse. And they knew that Jesus knew it. This is powerful. He bends down and begins to write in the ground. What did he write? Come on, John. Tell us what he wrote. Surely somebody noticed. All kinds of speculation, but he wrote on the ground. And they're still there. Okay, what's he going to do? And he looks up, and they repeat again. Okay, she was caught in the very act of adultery. The law says, now what are you going to do? What do you say? Okay, have at it. That's what the law says. Go for it. Let the first among you who is without sin cast the first stone. Back down, write it again. Now some have, again, filling in those blanks, it's been suggested that he was perhaps writing down certain sins. Adultery, bank embezzlement, money laundering, that anybody who was looking at would have known, would have swallowed hard. Or maybe he was writing down John and Fred, and one at a time. Jesus looks up, stands up again. There's only 2 characters there. The man, Jesus, and the woman. Unnamed woman. Okay, she's not going to get stoned. She probably didn't think she was. I mean, although that was the law, that didn't happen. The law was oftentimes written to make a point. Not that you have to enforce it. Some of our canon lawyers today would do well to think about that, wouldn't they? Every law doesn't have to be enforced every time. But nonetheless, she stands up and she's probably thinking, oh man, am I going to get it now? Those guys were a bunch of frauds. And again, filling in the blanks of the story, she might have been in a position to know what frauds they were better than anyone else. Those guys were a bunch of frauds. This guy, I don't know. I'm not sure who he is, but I've heard about him. He's a good man. He's going to let me have it. Some of you were at the Chrism Mass. I was illustrating this story, and I said, this story just begs for the wagged finger. Jesus looking at the woman. All the men are gone now. It's just her and him. He wouldn't have had to say a word. He just had to. Speaks volumes, doesn't it? You ever wagged your finger at somebody? Speaks. You don't even have to say anything. Symbols are powerful. Has no one condemned you? Her only 3 words in this story, this short story. Her only 3 words. She's the main character. I guess Jesus is the main character. But Her only 3 words are, "No one, sir." Now, again, you could have at least let her twist in the wind. Let her think about it. Okay. Go and try to do better. Go and from now on, don't sin. Don't commit this sin. No scarlet letter. No, go say 2 Our Fathers and 2 Hail Marys. Just go and try to do better. Again, prodigal son, at least on the way, was rehearsing his lines. I sinned against God and I sinned against you. In the story of the woman caught in the very act of adultery, it strikes me. She never says, "I'm sorry." She never says, "I made a mistake." She never says, "I know I sinned." Jesus just asked her, "Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir." Now, we picture ourselves standing there in this situation, waiting for the finger to be wagged, sweating bullets, and if given a chance to speak, we say, just falling off. I know what I did. I know it's terrible. She never says, "I'm sorry." Can it be that Jesus is telling us that God doesn't require that all the time? I'm not saying it's not a good thing to say we're sorry. But can it be that Jesus is portraying the mercy of God as so immense and so powerful as to outweigh any sorrow, any contrition that you and I might bring? Again, kind of different from the church, from the society we live in 2016, and even the church we live in. Final Bible story that I want to reflect upon is personal to me as a bishop because it has to do with the apostles, and according to our tradition, the bishop is the successor to the apostles. With the sole exception of the youngest of the apostles, John, the evangelists portray the apostles rather dreadfully in the time of Jesus' arrest and persecution and walk to Calvary and his agonizing death. They abandoned him. They began abandoning him in the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, "Come and watch with me, come and pray with me," and they fell asleep. Well, they just had a big dinner. He had plied them with wine. It was time for a nap. But so they were missing the point. They were missing the point that Jesus, even at the supper, had predicted what was going to happen. That Jesus had felt the sting of Judas leaving the table. So they began to abandon him there by falling asleep. When they came to arrest him, well, they were in full run. They took off. But Peter, good old Peter, he at least followed at a distance. He thought, this isn't out of control yet. I can save this. Goes to the court of Caiaphas. Now, if you've ever had a chance to visit Jerusalem, this site is remembered today by a church that's called St. Peter Gallicantu, which means St. Peter where the cock crowed. And so you go down in the undercroft of the church, and there is a cell dug that according to tradition is where Jesus was held overnight between Thursday and Friday before he was taken to trial. But outside this church, there's a beautiful sculpture of Peter sitting, head bowed in pain, and people around him, soldiers and a woman, pointing at him. Talk about a wag finger. And you don't even have to read the gospel. Peter's sitting there, and people are obviously speaking to him, and over Peter's shoulder is the cock, mouth wide open, the cock crowing. Ultimate personal humiliation. Jesus had told him when he said, "Oh, the others may abandon you, but not me, Lord." Peter, just keep your mouth shut. Yeah, that's what you want. Whenever you hear Peter start to talk in the gospel, you just want to say, "Peter, keep your mouth shut. This isn't going to turn out well for you." So it's the ultimate humiliation. He said, "I will not abandon you," and Jesus said, yeah. Before the cock crows 3 times, you will abandon me. So this look of pain on this sculpture of Peter tells it all. Jesus knew what was going to happen to him. So Jesus is carried off, he's crucified. We can, again, there's a lot that goes untold, but we're assuming that there's a crowd in Jerusalem. This was a real festival. It was a festival, but it was even all the more so because there was going to be an execution. There was going to be a crucifixion. So we assume that somehow these Galilean men had found a way to kind of be on the fringe of the crowd and watched, and their hearts were surely heavy. The man that they loved, the man who had loved them, was carrying a cross, was being whipped, was being persecuted, and ultimately they probably were somewhere where they could hear his screams when they put nails in his hands and in his feet and a lance in his side, and crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So Jesus is taken down from the cross, not by any of the 12 apostles. He's placed in a tomb. And then we're told that on the first day of the week, the disciples are again together. Now again, what you don't have to tell. Why were they together? Well, they were scared to death. They had seen this man who they had been very identifiable followers of, carried off, arrested, condemned, carried across, crucified, died and was buried. They had to wonder, are the ones that arrested him looking for us? Because they're not playing around here. They wanted to get rid of Jesus, and they did it in the most dastardly of ways. They're not going to just waltz away and know that there's 8, 10, 12, or 40 of us who were his followers. They're going to come looking for us. So the story says they were in this room, and the doors were locked, and the windows were sealed tightly. You can almost, if you really meditate on it, you almost feel it being stuffy, because the windows are closed and the doors are locked, because they're afraid. And it says because they were afraid. When Jesus stood in their midst. Now, first of all, you ought to appreciate some humor to this. Don't you think they all jumped this high? I mean, they counted. There's 11 of us in here. And all of a sudden, there was a 12th one. And they had to gasp, because they knew that an innocent man had been put to death. He was condemned. They had to expect, by all human reckoning, the wagged finger. Jesus coming. You saw what happened on Friday. Where were you?
On the cross.
No, you weren't. I know where you were. How could you? After all I've done, after all I've shown you. You know, you saw me touch a blind man's eyes and he saw again. You saw me touch a deaf man's ears and he heard again. You saw me take a hand and raise up a crippled man. You saw me raise Lazarus from the dead. You saw me, you were hungry, we were out in the desert, there were 5,000 people. I told you, let's share with them what we've got. And you said, we don't have enough. And we fed 5,000 people. You were there. Yet on Friday, when I had to carry that cross, they had to find a stranger who I'd never laid eyes on, who had never laid eyes on me. They had to find a stranger to help me carry that cross. Wag finger. Where were you? How dare you? How could you? And yet that's not what Jesus says. He says, according to the gospel, peace be with you. Okay, now what's next? Peace be with you. And it's in this context that Jesus goes on to say, whose sins you shall forgive are forgiven, and whose sins you shall retain are retained. Now, we always struggle with this, and again, the church can be very smug in saying, okay, the Lord gave the church the power, the charism to forgive sins, but He also told us we can hold that back. Trust me, I've been reading a whole lot of documents since Friday afternoon when the Pope's new exhortation came out. They remind us, some of these writers are quick to remind us, the Lord said we can retain sin. But remember when He said it, when He's standing with 11 people, 10 of whom who had abandoned Him, 10 of whom deserved the wag finger, and His message was peace be with you. Then He said, whose sins you shall forgive are forgiven, and if you retain them, they're retained. Who in the name of God can think of a sin we should retain when Jesus has just given peace to those apostles? This is the power of the story of mercy and how Jesus looked at those stories, starting with Adam and Eve, through Noah when he had decided, I'm going to just be done with all this, through David who failed, and who had been raised up and chosen to be the king who had failed, and then all the parables and gospel stories it has. Peace be with you. Now, that's easier said than done. There are times where somebody's hurt me or has hurt you, and sometimes there are people that we love and love dearly. There are people that should have been the last person in the world to have caused us hurt or pain, or vice versa. We've been in a position where we've hurt or disappointed somebody, the last person in the world we should have ever hurt or caused pain. Jesus is just portraying in the Scriptures, and by His life, the infinite mercy of God. I will say that as a priest, without even question, some of the most powerful moments of my priesthood have been in the confession, where the church has found in its tradition that Christ instituted sacraments, outward signs, instituted by Christ to give grace. One of those, which has looked a lot of different ways through the centuries, is the sacrament of God's mercy. All the sacraments are sacraments of God's mercy, but particularly the sacrament of reconciliation. And the power of seeing people come to say, I am a sinner, and expecting some due consequence. And again, there are due consequences in life. You know, we make mistakes and we mess up. But to hear a man or a woman talk about being a source of pain in their marriage, that they've committed adultery, they've been unfaithful, that perhaps even the marriage failed and cannot be put back together, and they understand they bear the responsibility for that. I think sometimes they actually want a wagged finger. It would feel better if someone would just say, you really are ornery. You really are despicable. But as a priest, I believe, and again, you've got to let people feel that. You've got to let people experience that. But ultimately, you have to remind people, nothing you've done puts you beyond the mercy of God. Tell you a somewhat recent confession, a few months, anonymously, obviously. I don't get many chances to hear confessions because I'm not in a parish, but oftentimes at some of our youth gatherings, I'll hear confessions. And sometimes, although there is a movement, kids are going to a confession a lot more than they were, or some kids are. And I'm in a big room. There's hundreds of people there I'm trying to hear because they got a band playing or something. And so I don't know how much but this kid, little guy's sitting across from me, shielding his face, naming his sins. And his sin, which if you read anything about our modern culture, was his addiction to pornography and the things that pornography leads to. That's hard to say out loud. That's hard to say face to face with another person. So he was avoiding saying that face to face. But, mumbling, and I'm trying my best. Bless me, Father. I looked at porn. And so, again, he was waiting. That's what when I having a couple years ago, the homily I gave for the ordination of our new priest, it was early on in the papacy of Francis, and I was reading everything I could, and probably about the time Francis had announced the coming year of mercy. And I talked about the privilege that these young men would have to hear confessions. And I said, the one thing they don't need is for you to get out the book and reference to them what their sin is. They wouldn't be there if they didn't know that. People don't come to confession unless they know what their sin is. That chapter's already been covered. Move on. So to be able to say to somebody, your sins are forgiven. This little guy. Just struck my hand. So your sins are forgiven. And he He said, really? I said, really? He said, that's not my idea. It's Jesus. And then I often in that case will quickly retell that short story of the woman caught in adultery. And it's amazing how that story, in its brevity, captures human imagination because, let's face it, 14, 15-year-old boys and girls haven't had the best catechesis for the most part. I don't care where they go to school. And some families have done a good job, but the church has a lot to learn there. But you start telling that story, they know every aspect of it. They know about her being caught in adultery. They know about the men who walked her up there. They know about Jesus humiliating the men by telling them, okay, go at it, throw the first stone. They know about Jesus not lecturing the woman, but simply saying, go and try to do better. So it's a powerful story. I told the priest, I'd tell priest and myself, if anyone ever leaves a confessional not feeling good, I have to ask if I've committed a sin. I mean, I am there for one reason, to be an instrument of God's mercy to someone. And so, now granted, some people do leave the confessional not feeling good, I'm going to admit that. But they are so burdened that it's going to take several times probably for them to get that. But if they leave there feeling badly because of anything I said, well then I'm the one that needs to go to confession. Because my place in the church, certainly in that confessional experience, is to convey the mercy of God.